Welcome to another episode of This is Revolution. The host for today is Varn of Varn Vlog. Good to see you, Varn.
Hi. I get to be Jason today.
It's what we all want. Deep down.
And we know I'm not Jason because we started on time.
Ooh. Ouch. Ouch. All right. Do you want to just jump in?
Sure.
Okay. Today we have Benjamin Fong, as we have it written out here. He is the host of a new podcast from Jacobin called Organized the Unorganized. And we're going to bring him in so he can talk about it. Hi, Ben. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks so much for having me.
Good to see you.
You too.
Thanks. Well, you can't see
Hello.
me. Varn? We both
Hi,
listened to
and
it.
so
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we both listened to the current episodes available of Organizing Disorganized, this podcast that you have begun with Jacobin. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about why talk about the history of the CIO right now? Like, why is this a pressing issue for the current left? I mean, I agree that it is. That's not a skeptical question, but I do think it needs to be stated before we really get into the substance here.
Sure, yeah. If we're looking for a kind of historical precedent for organizing millions of private sector workers in particular into the labor movement, there's really one time to look to. There's been moments of periodic upsurge in America. Most of those have been fairly fleeting, thinking in particular of the dramatic growth of the Knights of Labor in 1886. There's a huge uptick in labor activity in around like the turn of the century with the AFL organizing. Then again, during and in the immediate aftermath of World War I. And then there's the sort of 1960s and 70s public sector unionism surge, but that was really a different kind of sector than the CIO was engaged with. The CIO moment, the late 30s, early 40s, this was a time when millions of workers, private sector workers, joined the labor movement, and the key corporations of the time, GM, U.S. Steel, were organized. I mean, before that, the core industries in America, steel, rubber, auto, electrical manufacturing, all these things were unorganized. And very quickly, in the space of a few years, those sectors became almost 100% unionized, and that had knock-on effects for other industries and raising wages and, creating like what we know as the prosperity of the post-war period. It's a little worse today, actually, than it was then. Public sector unionism was not yet legal, and so the 10%. So, in the 1930s, before the Great Depression and the CIO, union density was around 10%, but that was 10% private sector, which is kind of a better situation than we're in now. Today, private sector union density is down to about 6%. I think we're about to get the latest BLS numbers in a couple days now, and as exciting as 2023 was in terms of labor activity, I wouldn't be surprised if that number is more depressing than we'd like to think it would be. I think there's a lot of similarities there, a lot of differences as well. And in any event, if we're looking for inspiration for the present moment, I think it's the best time to look to.
I think your reason to be skeptical in the numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually pretty sound. The last couple of years, we've seen a lot of uptick in labor actions. We've actually seen a decrease in union density, and that's a reversal of even, say, 10 years ago, where there was a very mild increase of union density, but mostly in public sector workers. Yep. And if we really look at the public sector worker stats, it gets a little bit more concerning, since the largest unions are still the police unions. So it's there are reasons to point out that we're actually in a worse situation than we were in the beginning of the CIO.
Yeah,
for those right. who are new to the history of labor, though, can we describe? I mean, you mentioned the Knights of Labor in the AFL. Um, People are going to bring up the early IWW too. Can we talk about the CIOs different from the Knights of Labor and the AFL and maybe even the IWW?
Sure. Just quickly about the previous point in terms of differences. I think one other key difference between, well, there's a lot of differences, and I think that there would be some historians who would argue that the conditions of the emergence of the CIO are so different than the present moment that it's almost non-applicable as a historical example. So I should just throw that out there as well. I think I disagree with that. Obviously, I think that there are some organizational, political lessons to be drawn from the moment. But to get to, one way in which it was different is just that labor law today tends to channel labor activity in very particular and conscripted ways. So in the 1930s, this was a moment where, thanks to the 1932 Norris LaGuardia Act and then the Wagner Act, and just a sort of general willingness to push the boundaries of what labor was willing to do, there was widespread disruption. And I think that's part of what made possible the CIO moment, that labor activists were willing to push the boundaries of the acceptable. And today, given the very constrained NLRB process, which I think most like labor law experts and labor historians recognize as fairly broken, given that, it tends to channel labor activism into recognition elections, union certification drives, and for good reason. If you can get a contract through those means, it's generally a good thing. It's just that it's become so harrowing a process for so many people that it's almost not worth the effort in a lot of cases. And so it's a different time in terms of just like the way in which labor activism is directed. But to get to your last question, so the American Federation of Labor was the dominant labor federation starting in the late 1880s. In a way, it emerged as a rival to the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor won this huge rail strike. I think it was in 1886. And as a result of that, and as a result of a lot of radicals in their ranks, they grew pretty dramatically. I mean, I think they grew to a membership of almost 1 million people within the space of a year. It was a very dramatic growth. Organizationally, the Knights of Labor couldn't hold it together. So there were a lot of egalitarian impulses within the organization, but at the very top, it was really floundering. I'm forgetting his name, Terrence, the head of the Knights of Labor. I'm forgetting his name now. But in any event, the Knights of Labor had this spectacular rise and then just as spectacular fall. It just didn't hold together organizationally. And the lesson for people like Samuel Gompers and the people who founded the AFL was that you needed some stable business form for unionism. You needed to channel it in a particular form that had leverage and power and sustainability. If you didn't have that, then you'd have these upsurges and then fall away. So with the AFL, they focus particularly on craft workers, people who had particular skills in their industries. They were predominantly a racist and exclusionary organization, sort of by default, right? They focused on what used to be called old stock Americans and organizing them. And so were very anti-immigrant, did not organize Black people, did not organize Chinese people. They were actively hostile to both. And so they formed a labor movement that was almost purposefully self-limiting. Right? They wanted a labor movement that was just for skilled workers. And it was successful for what it was. Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL, liked to talk about pure and simple unionism, right? Like, don't get involved in politics, although the AFL did get involved in politics here and there. Don't raise like broader social justice issues. Focus on industry contracts, craft industry contracts, and take care of your members. That was essentially the model. And it wasn't particularly successful in growing the labor movement, but it was successful in maintaining that staying power. And so from the 1880s, really up until the 1930s, when the CIO broke off, it was growing at times. It was fairly stable. Its members could rely upon it. And I think that that's part of what accounts for the staying power of the AFL, just that it did work for the people who were involved in it. And long past the point when it made sense as something applicable to the economic situation of the United States, people were still defending it to the death, right? They were still defending the jurisdictional claims of different craft unions, despite the fact that they made almost no sense in the new mass production industries, right? The key corporations of America were not organized on a craft basis, right? This idea of itinerant workers going from town to town with particular skills and bringing those skills along and needing to maintain their membership in the craft unions in order to maintain certain standards of living. Well, you with rapid industrialization and these new mass production factories, that didn't really make sense of a lot of people's work situations. And so the AFL model, it was very powerful for the people who were attached to it. But by the 1930s, it had just become clearly outmoded. Just quickly with regard to the IWW, it's an interesting relationship there. I'm surprised that more hasn't been written about the CIO's relationship to the IWW. Sorry. I think that a lot of the key organizers of the CIO were clearly inspired by the IWW. Some had been directly involved with it as well. I think the key difference, though, is this. The IWW was, they privileged the capacity for disruption above other things. And so when the CIO came along, and especially after the Wagner Act, everyone, and that goes from John L. Lewis, the head of the CIO, to communist organizers in Ohio, everyone agreed that the point of all this disruption was to channel it into stable contracts, to channel it into modern collective bargaining. And that was something that the IWW is not committed to, is not committed to contract sanctity in the same way. And so when the CIO moment rolls around, they say, we do not want to do what the IWW did. Like, okay, sure, we'll allow radicals in here and there, but we don't want to just privilege disruption. We don't want to fight just to fight. We want contracts. And we're in a political moment where that's possible to get them. And so I think that's the key difference really between the IWW and the CIO, despite the fact that they drew inspiration from that earlier moment. They largely renounced the goals of disruption and privileging that sort of what you could call more romanticized aspect of working class activism.
I think it's interesting to compare the IWW to the CIO for that reason, although I can tell you what the IWW would say about the CIO in response to that. And that is because that is the concessions made to keep those contracts put you in a bad situation in the 1950s.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to note how many people involved in the CIO kind of came out of the IWW. And a lot of them came through the explicitly communist organization around the TUEL and the TUUL. But I think it's also interesting to talk about labor law. You made a point about the AFL and the craft union structure. I think people don't often understand craft and guild unionism today. Yeah. We understand guild unionism a little bit because we know how the electricians unions work, etc. But the crafts within the industry and the problems of that, I think, were kind of made obvious again in the railroad situation, about 2 years ago, because for reasons having to do with national industry and national security, railroads are exempt from the National Labor Relations Act.
Yeah. And
so they are still organized along AFL lines, not along, later lines of the CIO and post-Wagner Act kind of situations. And that is clearly a problem. It really weakens their ability to act. So I think that's a crucial point. And for people who don't know why it still matters today, well, that's one of the reasons. So, can we talk a little bit about John Lewis in the CIO's rise? Like, what role did Lewis particularly play? How did they really start to split from the AFL? And what was there? How were they able to leverage the situation in the 1930s in the way that other groups were just not able to, including other groups that we mentioned, like the IWW and the TUEL?
I'll come back to Lewis in a second. I just want to make a quick comment about craft unionism,
Mm-hmm.
because I agree. I think that the reasons for and limitations of craft unions are not always appreciated for what they are, and especially in the first episode. And this is something that a lot of my guests emphasize. Just to be clear, the podcast is not much of me. It's mostly labor historians and experts who I've interviewed. It's archival clips, it's songs, and so it's a lot of different perspectives put into one podcast. And one thing a lot of people emphasize, actually to a degree that kind of surprised me, was the respect they had for the craft model. They said that it made a certain sense, and that if you're just being sober about what works for organized labor, you have to recognize that particular skills, are a key source of leverage. And what happened with the organization of mass production industries is that a new point of leverage, a new sort of complex network of points of leverage, came about that could be taken advantage of. And so the CIO was very smart about thinking about, okay, these mass production workers, right? They don't have any particular skills. Yes, it's hard work, but you're not just dealing with like tool and die makers who are very skilled people. You're dealing with people who, you can retrain within the space of a week or so, and so who are fairly dispensable. Well, that doesn't offer you a lot of power in the labor market, right? And so they had to understand the particular ways in which these new industries were put together so as to have what was called, by a lot of people, power at the point of production, right? The ability to shut things down so that like the factories couldn't run. Well, in a deindustrialized economy, you kind of lose that power, the disruptive capacity, occupying factories and whatnot, shutting things down at your workplace. It's not quite as impactful, especially if you're not targeting things like the motor facilities at GM and whatnot. Um, Skill, by contrast, offers a pretty reliable source of power. If you have skills, it is really tempting for labor people to focus on that and that alone. You still see that, like in the disjunction between healthcare unions and nurses unions, right? Nurses unions are very protective over nurses. Nurses are extremely valuable, of course, and that's why they have that power. But the NNU, it's essentially a craft union, right? They operate along craft models. They think that the people who are their members have power because of their particular skills in the labor market, not because they can shut things down at the point of production. And so that tension is still very much with us. But I think it's a legitimate one, right? Like if you're not going to be able to shut things down at the point of production, if you're not able to, occupy Chevy plant number 4 and shut things down, well, you need to have some other point of leverage. And I think that underlying logic of craft unionism will never go away so long as people have certain skills that can be exploited in that way. All right, sorry, long digression about craft unionism. John O. Lewis, he was the head of the mine workers union for a long time. He was generally recognized to be a dictatorial and autocratic guy. He did not run a democratic union. He was brutal in the 1920s. A lot of the people who came to work for the CIO later, he had kicked out of the mine workers in the 1920s. He was, as basically all of my guests said, he was interested in power and power alone, and was very effective at wielding it. And in the 1920s, because of various changes in the economy, one part of the coal industry, the bituminous coal industry, was dying essentially. There were lots of changes that weren't really conducive to the mine workers organizing in the 20s, and so in addition to being autocratic and just really brutal within the union was also shrinking. And so by the time the Great Depression hits, the UMWA is really decimated. This all changes in 1933. Lewis had been very instrumental in pushing for Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which promised workers the right to organize and collectively bargain. It was largely a symbolic gesture in the NIRA, but it offered some means of organizing. So Lewis and the miners went out into the coal fields and they said, "Hey, the president wants you to join a union. Come sign up for the mine workers union." And by and large, they did. And thanks to the NIRA, they organized the 1933 coal contract, which covered most of the industry. It was the coal code was something they had sought basically since their founding in 1890. And they won it, and all of a sudden the UMWA was huge. It was like 600,000 members, and that changed things. And Lewis said, "Look, like everyone should be doing this right now. This is a completely unique political economic situation. We've got this radial crisis in the Great Depression, and we've got an administration that is not great, but they're at least willing to listen, right? And they understand the need for some kind of broad changes. And liberals are different than they were today. They were more like plugged into reality. They understood that industrial capitalism had its failings, and so they were open to unions in a way that they hadn't been before. And Lewis took advantage, and he was still an autocratic guy. He was still a pain to deal with, but he recognized the moment and he broke away from the AFL in 1935. It was actually a fairly dramatic break. He supposedly jumped over a row of chairs on the floor of the 1935 AFL convention to punch the Carpenters President Union in the face. And then formed the CIO, and they began organizing rubber, auto, steel, and succeeded remarkably in a very short amount of time.
So there's two themes that come up to me as we're discussing, and I think we're going to be torn between talking about now and talking about the past, and that's also part of the nature of your podcast.
Yeah.
But I wanted to zoom in on your point about craft and guild unions, because one of the things I think that you make, one of the points that you make that is hard for us to see how to deal with today is the implications of decentralizing, deindustrializing, and even franchising the workforce, and the way guild unions are able to leverage that. So the carpenters union, the electricians union, etc. For those of you who don't know, guild unions and craft unions are not exactly the same thing, but they're very close. So, and when we think of unionized workers today, and we're not thinking about government workers, that those are the people we think about for the most part, unless we are going back to 50s hard hat nostalgia. There are interesting exceptions, though, and some of them are in a kind of liminal space, such as the auto workers unions, which is a broad scale industrial union in the past. But some might argue today that actually the shift in auto production means that they may be a little bit closer to a craft union than we'd like to admit, because it is somewhat skilled labor. It is a smallish industry. If you look at the broader movement of the UAW, the UAW's just base of what it can organize is smaller, and it realizes that. I mean, that's part of why it got into things not related to auto production, such as TAs. But I think I think studying the history of the CAO then does present us with an interesting problem when we're talking about workplaces today. Like the big union struggles of the past 10 years have been Amazon. Okay, so that does kind of look like a factory. Starbucks, which absolutely does not. And the resurgence of teachers' unions in red states, and nurses' unions and nursing union strikes. Those both interestingly do and don't follow the kind of CAO model. And the part I say where they do is that hospitals, schools, police stations are still fairly centralized workplaces, as opposed to, say, Starbucks, which is, when you're dealing with a Starbucks contract and a local, you might be dealing with 50, 60 workers at a time, as opposed to 500 or 1,000. I guess the question becomes, what can we learn from the CIO given the difference of conditions?
Yeah. There's a great new book out. I think it was just last year. It was an interview with a historian named John Womack that Peter Olney did called Labor, Power, and Strategy. And it's got, reflections on that interview from a lot of like leading sort of labor strategists, Bill Fletcher, Jane McAlevey, et cetera. And it's a really interesting interview. And one of the things that Womack says is that, this phrase power at the point of production, which we tend to associate with the CIO, it's used somewhat, casually today. But what he appreciated about the CIO moment was that it's not just that they were like, okay, like let's just like, occupy the factories and that'll win us power. It's rather that they saw the connections in the new production processes, and he thinks that's what's important. And he goes back to Wyndham Mortimer's autobiography called Organize. Mortimer was likely, I think, a member of the Communist Party. He came up through the UMWA. He was sort of a key organizer in the early UAW. And what Womack notices about Mortimer is that he's remarkably sophisticated about thinking through like what were the weaknesses in the points of in the chains of production distribution. And so when the Flint strike was won, for instance, in 1937, they occupied those factories for a long time, and right up until the end they didn't think they were going to win. Right? I mean, it wouldn't have taken much for Governor Murphy to send in the National Guard and just ruin the whole thing. And all of the things that we think about happening in 1937, including, the dramatic growth of the UAW, as well as the organization of the steelworkers, none of that happens, it seems, without Flint. And it all was made possible by the fact that they staged this, huge distraction in one plant, and then secretly occupied the motor plant, Chevy plant number 4, because they understood that was the key thing, right? You cannot make cars without motors, and that was the one motor facility in the country. They had studied it, they understood that. It was an understanding of the links in production and distribution that made possible the strategic disruption that they needed at that particular moment. We don't have today fixed capital in these huge factories, right? Like, I mean, you could argue for Amazon, right? But if JFK 8 ever got through that process, right? If by some miracle they got a contract, what's going to happen? Like you can move that factory across the street, fire all the workers, and like not have a union anymore. Like there are infinite number of ways in which to break unions today. So the question today is not just flatly applying that model and saying, oh, let's take over the factories and occupy them, right? It's understanding the links, the chains in our deindustrialized logistical economy and finding new sources of leverage. And I should say again, like to go back to the craft and guild discussion, the AFL should be faulted for what it was, for what it did wrong, and that was a lot. But what it did right was to understand that that skill offers a point of leverage, and workers should take advantage of all points of leverage, right? Like we have these romantic ideas about how unions should be organized and how working class people should join together. Well, depending upon your occupation, there's all sorts of different points of leverage that can be sometimes combined, sometimes used on their own, sometimes used in some cases, not others. And I think some variegated understanding of how we organize workers today is much needed. And without just thinking flatly about, we don't have those big factories anymore, and so it's not applicable. Well, they're understanding the links in the chain, and they were saying, if there's any point of leverage, take advantage of it. Take advantage. I should also say, in the CIO moment, it wasn't just, disruptive power at the point of production. They were doing all sorts of really innovative things. Like, for instance, the steelworkers are an interesting case because no one on the left really cares about the steelworkers because they were not a democratic union. They were top down from the beginning, not the sort of romanticized new left understanding of unions. But the steelworkers, what they did was, one, John L. Lewis and Myron Taylor, the head of U.S. Steel, they sat down for for a number of meetings at the Willard Hotel, this fancy hotel, and just sort of hammered out terms like between themselves, about as top down as you can get. But they also had a strategy of going in and taking over the company unions. That's not a sexy strategy, like to go in and try to deal with these obviously compromised institutions. But it worked, right? Like they found a place where workers were getting together and they were able to use the company union structure against itself, really. So there was a lot that the CIO did besides just occupy big factories in a dramatic way that led to its success.
Yeah, the company unions are an interesting part of U.S. history. They're very brief, but for those of you who don't know, before the National Labor Relations Act, there was an act that allowed the corporations themselves to set up quasi-unions that were kind of on a, let's say, a corporatist in the old sense of that word model. So, workers working in concert with their owners in a kind of very, very compromised union. And I think it is important to point out that the CAO really did leverage those, try to take those over, get those integrated in. Another thing that makes the CAO interesting, I mean, John, I bring up, John Lewis for a reason, because I think he's one of these people that you can easily make a hero or a villain until you actually study him. And then you realize that, like, oh, this is a very complicated guy who is both very successful, but you're right, comes out of an absolutely autocratic union tradition, the kind of people that Marx and Engels called labor aristocrats. Like there is a reality to that. But he was willing to work with like almost anybody. I mean, the CIO was totally willing to work with the TUEL, which for people who don't know, that was an explicitly communist orientation.
Yeah.
And Lewis was not particularly sympathetic to communists. Like it was it was not, he just seemed to have an everything in the kitchen sink strategy to to getting the CIO to have a mass base. I mean, but I was going to ask you, so there's that element of the CIO. There's also its kind of complicated relationship to U.S. labor law, because it seems to me that Lewis being able to really break with the AFL and form the CIO is tied to the conditions that lead also up to the National Labor Relations Act. So, and what is the kind of relationship do you see between the CIO and changing labor law in the 1930s?
Yeah, I mean, just real quickly about Lewis. I mean, he was an asshole start to finish. There's like no two ways about it. Like even when he was the champion of labor, he was being awful behind the scenes. And he was actually like quite, I mean, I think that when we think of like good union leaders, we think of, I don't know. I mean, someone like Harry Bridges or someone. I mean, someone who, understood understood what it was to be a union leader, but like still felt himself part of the rank and file, like that kind of thing, right? Lewis was not that at all. Lewis thought of himself as a kind of aristocrat. Like he didn't interact with other labor leaders. You could argue that he didn't like being a part of the labor movement. I mean, he really isolated himself in a lot of ways. And so he was, I mean, from one angle, about as bad as a labor leader can be. And I think that we just have to like live with that contradiction, that like, despite that fact, he was still able to see an opportunity at the right moment. So I think it's a sort of model lesson in not overly vilifying certain people, because you never know, like when someone's going to see a particular opportunity. And Melvin Dubofsky, who's written along with Warren Van Tyne the definitive biography of Lewis, he said from start to finish, Lewis was interested in power. In the 1920s, he did about as good as he could, right, in a dying industry, with new welfare capitalism that was sort of like cutting into like union gains. Like it was, it was a failure, but you don't necessarily need to blame him given the conditions. And then in the 1930s, he saw a completely new situation and he took advantage of it, because he was interested in his own power. So, it's good to see these things as contradictory and mixed rather than romanticized. I think you're right about that. So the relation between labor policy, labor law, and the moment. I mean, I think it's best to see those two things, in a sort of dialectical progression, right? It wasn't just that one made possible the other, but that there was a kind of interplay, that there was a figuring out of what kind of thing would work for the present moment, given what was going on in, disruption and organizing and whatnot. And so, some people, if you read Elizabeth Cohen's Making a New Deal, or Robert Zieger's The CIO, which is really the sort of like key text about the CIO. You read them, and a lot of importance is accorded to the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? This, what was ultimately a flawed corporatist attempt to rein in big business practices, right? Had this one section 7A, that said, we recognize the right of workers to form unions of their own choosing. It wasn't, it didn't really have teeth. It wasn't enforced in such a way that like actually gave most workers unions. But it was an inspiration. And again, Lewis, Sidney Hillman, and David Dubinsky and the garment workers unions, they all said, look, this is an opportunity. We can go out and say, for the first time in a while, seemingly, the government is saying, go for it. Yeah, now's the time. And they took advantage of that, I think, quite well. And so from one angle, you could say, somewhat unintentionally, this policy made possible new union organizing. Well, some people also say that the, what was going on in the early 30s, sort of like unemployment marches, lots of other sort of forms of disruption, the sort of nascent beginnings of the sit-down strike, it was that disruption, and of course the radial crisis of the Great Depression, that spurred Roosevelt to add Section 7A to the Recovery Act. And so, from one angle, it's the organizing and disruption that led to it. From another angle, it's the policy that made possible new organizing. And I think it's both really. It was a dynamic situation. It was a fluid situation. So the Wagner Act, which really, sanctified collective bargaining. It's still with us today, albeit in, dramatically reduced and constraining form. That was passed in 1935. And almost right away, the big companies said, we're not going to obey this. This is ridiculous. This is unconstitutional. We don't have to, go through this sort of government-led process of recognizing unions. We're not going to recognize them. They also started a whole bunch of new company unions as well. They're like, we can contain this. It's not a big deal. And so it wasn't really until after the Flint strike and 37 that the Supreme Court finally declares the Wagner Act constitutional. Why was that? Jeremy Brecker, a labor historian who's I interview on the podcast, he says you'd have to get into the minds of the justices to understand why they finally declared the Wagner Act constitutional and very shortly thereafter declared the sit-down strike unconstitutional. But it's really difficult to see this broad-scale change in the justice's opinion without looking to what was going on in the country. After Flint, the sit-down strike spread everywhere. Like the disruptiveness was everywhere. And so they looked at the Wagner Act and they said, this is a chance to stabilize things. This is a chance to channel this disruption into stable collective bargaining and stop all this industrial strife. So, I think it's dynamic. I think that the organizing led to the policy, and the policy impacted the organizing. And it really wasn't until the war, I would say, that things leveled out, with the War Labor Board and, the CIOs buying into the war efforts and willingness to, sign no strike pledges and all this stuff. It wasn't really until then that things really evened out. And that dialectic, that sort of dynamic situation between law and organizing, that sort of stopped and settled into, what we know as the post-war compromise.
Yeah, thank you. I was about to use the D word myself. Uh, a word oft abused, but actually accurate in this case, in the sense that like you're dealing with situations that are informing each other, and to use more modern tolerance and feedback with each
Yeah.
other. Um, and I think with the CIO, you know, you have a dialectic of both success and reaction in a lot of the same actions. We talk about the Supreme Court. I mean, I think people often forget, maybe they don't forget now because it's becoming obvious again, how historically hostile the Supreme Court has been to
Yeah.
labor, both post 1950s and pre 1935, really. I mean, and um, and I think you're right to point out that part of that is an attempt to de-radicalize labor, like, but it creates space for labor to actually operate and work and do more than just disrupt. Because, as anyone who's ever talked about trying to turn a riot into a political movement, disruption happens organically a lot, but doing something with disruption is actually kind of hard.
Yeah.
So, um, I think that is a key thing to point out about the way in which the CAO operated. I want to talk a little bit about the war, though, because there's a couple of things that happened during the war, and again, I think we can view this almost dialectically, in that they're opposing impulses. So, like, you have all these concessions to the war effort, no strike pledges, some of which were quite unpopular with actual union membership. Um, at the same time, you have also, partly due to the war, the emergence of a more viable popular front with communists, because of both the communist own dropping of their united front from below strategy, which I'm not going to get into my opinion about whether or not I think that was a mistake, but it did change conditions on the ground, and their and the United States' willingness to play more favorably with the Soviets because they were allies, technically, on paper at least. So, what? How did that kind of double movement in two different directions
Yeah.
affect the CIO?
Just quickly about disruption. Sometimes it's spontaneous.
Mm,
Sometimes it happens organically. I would say that the key disruptive actions that the CIO took were not at all spontaneous. And one
mm,
thing that Nelson Lichtenstein, labor historian, emphasized at many times during our interview is that he just thinks that no one should use the word spontaneous anymore. He thinks that, that nothing is spontaneous. That spontaneous is a word that you use when you're coming to a situation without sort of seeing both the organizing lead up to it as well as the particular political economic conditions that led to it. And I think that's I mean, sometimes things happen, right? Sometimes things happen that you don't expect to happen, and a lot of the skill of labor, social justice activism organizations comes in finding ways to channel that in the right ways. um, but a lot of it's not. A lot of it's planned, and I think that finding a room for not just blowing up pipelines and this sort of like dramatic like action kind of thing, finding a place for strategic disruption, to think about like, well, what will wound capital in the right way so that it pays attention and like we can offer some leverage here. I think that that's a conversation that's sorely in need of resuming today. That conversation about strategic illegality and disruption, given the constraints of labor law. It's also worth emphasizing that you know unions come in a variety of forms. Obviously,
mm,
comes in a variety of orientations. But at the end of the day, if a union is not willing to cut a deal, if it's not willing to say, okay, this is something that we can settle on, so that not that the employer is happy about it, but that they are willing to sort of drop their fighting, at least momentarily. it doesn't really have any power. And I think that that's the sort of contradiction of the union form. It's been long recognized in like leftist and revolutionary traditions for a long time, right? The union's a contradictory institution. And I think that sometimes we romanticize it and say that, you know, the union is this like fighting machine. It's not a fighting machine. It fights when it needs to. You know, there's a lot of pinbacks from the CIO period in particular. It says like, I don't want to fight, but if I have to, I will. Or I don't want to strike, but if I have to, I will. And I think that was kind of the ethos of the time, right? They were like, we're going to go out if we need to go out. But the point is not to go out. The point is not to fight. The point is to win. And you only win if you can find something to settle on. And I think that's the sort of brilliance of the contract. That's the way in which temporary moments of disruptive radical consciousness get institutionalized in a particular form that has some sustainability. And there's something worse than a bad union. It's when the union goes away altogether. And traditionally throughout American history, that's what happened. You know, there were these brilliant moments of upsurge in consciousness and revolutionary and radical activity. And then because of employer opposition and, you know, the willingness to send in the guns, it got shut down. And the CIO moment, yeah, it was compromised in all sorts of ways, but they found a way to institutionalize that. They found a way to channel it in the right way. And, you know, we can fault them for that, as many new left historians have. But I think that there's a certain innovativeness there that's worth appreciating as well. You know, the war, I think, the war was an opportunity, and I think everyone recognized it. Many CIO leaders, Lewis himself, but you know, by the war, it's important to state Lewis was out of the CIO. So Lewis renounced FDR in the lead up to the 1940 election. He scheduled this much hyped speech where a lot of people said he was going to announce the beginning of a Labor Party. At least that's what a lot of people hoped for. And at that moment, he endorsed Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate. This shouldn't have been so surprising, you know, given Lewis's background. He'd been a lifelong Republican. His relationship with FDR was quite fractious, despite the fact that they worked together. And so Lewis and the mine workers exit the CIO, and they're actually quite disruptive during the war. They think that you know, giving in to no strike pledges and whatnot is a huge mistake. You could argue that they were right about that because they won big contracts in the process, even though that they pissed everyone off in doing so. But the key CIO leaders at that point, Philip Murray, Sidney Hillman in particular, they all said, you know, like, what do we want? We want some role in determining government policy. And the War Labor Board, on which sat many CIO leaders, was an opportunity to do so, right? I mean, they believed in the cause first and foremost. They believed in fighting against fascism, and they saw that threat, and constantly, Lewis, Hillman, and others would say the best way to fight against what's going on in Germany and Italy is to have a strong labor movement. What was, you know, they noted that what was happening there involved the wiping out of the labor movement in Italy and Germany. And so they would say, you want to fight against fascism? You want to fight this war? Support organized labor. And so they took that opportunity. And you could argue that the ascendant period of the CIO really kind of ended in 1937 after Little Steel and, you know, the Memorial Day Massacre, the failure of this really magnificent strike at the so-called Little Steel companies. You know, that was a moment where Roosevelt kind of abandons organized labor. They lose the strike. In fact, a lot of CIO people are fired from Republic Steel and other Little Steel companies. And then the CIO kind of levels off, right? It had seemed like this giant behemoth. And then after Little Steel, it kind of just levels off and, you know, it's kind of uncertain. Well, you know, what changes the occasion or what changes the circumstances? It's the war, right? It's a lot of people recognizing, you know, we can't have this labor disruptiveness all the time if we're going to have war production. And so Ford finally capitulates to the UAW in 1941. Little Steel finally capitulates to the steelworkers in 1941. And so all of a sudden, industry and business, because of the war situation, are aligned in a way that they weren't before. And that promise of the CIO, the promise to deliver the end of industrial strife through stable collective bargaining, that seemed really appealing during the war when you needed to have constant productivity. And so it was used. And so, CIO membership jumped dramatically during the war. But, it was also a time when things began to be constrained finally. And like I said before, this is when it leveled off. And so many CIO unions agreed to no strike pledges during this time. It helped, of course, that, as you said, the communists were fully involved in the war effort. We should talk about the communists more, but they were discredited in one respect already by the war, because a lot of people were like why are they switching political positions on this? Like what's going on here exactly, right? A lot of people, and not just top CIO brass, like a lot of rank and file workers were like, what is going on with these communists in my union, right? They like have all these political positions that seem to like flip flop overnight. There's something odd here. But in as much as they were involved in the war effort, it was all fine temporarily. But it certainly helped that the communists were for the war effort. It meant that all those CIO unions where the communists were active and influential, they were fully on board. And a lot of radical labor historians, Stoughton Lind, perhaps most of all, has faulted the communists like pretty severely for having bought into this effort and not maintained their independence. And so it was a moment again where the CIO made huge gains, but it had become a fully, you could say, bureaucratized movement at that point. That spark, that energy, that ascendance, that dynamism of the early CIO, it was really muted in the war. And there was a huge strike wave right after the war, 1946. But it didn't have the kinds of effects that were desired. And in any event, it brought on a severe backlash in the form of Taft-Hartley in 1947. And that was really sort of like when things were muted.
Yeah, I think emphasizing the feedback loops here is probably a helpful way to understand it, because you have this strike wave that's unleashed. It's kind of pent up during the war, right? Like it's really kind of back striking, and there is also the development of a popular front with Wallace that seems to be concerning a lot of people. And the communist leadership here, I think there is also a kind of secondary fault that we kind of have to talk about that with the communists, is that the communists started hiding their positions, probably partly in backlash to how all over the place they seemed in the late 1930s.
Yeah.
And so when at the state level you started leading up to the beginnings of what would become the Red Scare, Red Scare number 2 or 4, depending on how you're counting. It really was easy to accuse a lot of the communist leadership of hiding their positions because they had.
Yeah.
And so these two kinds kind of seem to play together. I wanted to talk to you though, during this time period, the CAO kind of has a dual nature where it's progressive-ish on racial integration and kind of seems to learn a little bit even from the IWW on like making sure you integrate Black workers to some degree, confronting anti-Black sentiment within the unions itself, particularly for example in efforts to support the Fair Employment Practices Commission. But they actually weren't particularly good at dealing with sexual discrimination, particularly during and right after the war.
Yeah.
How do you think that affected their viability and popularity at the time?
Just quickly about the communists. So they did hold their cards close to their chests in a lot of cases, and that didn't help in building trust with other union leaders. It's oftentimes the case though that there. I mean, it's like with any political circles, right? There are people who are the firebrands and the card carrying members, and then there's people who are just sympathetic, right? Like, I'm not part of a lot of organizations that I'm quite sympathetic to and talk to people in and whatnot. And in the case of a lot of CIO leaders, there was some fuzziness around this, but it's just in the sort of nature of like how political associations work. So Harry Bridges, for instance, who was branded as a communist throughout his life, like all these like deportation trials and whatnot, like he was the the one of the main guys targeted in the whole communist purge. It's not clear that he was ever a member of the Communist Party. A recent biography of Bridges by Robert Cherney, who I interviewed for the podcast, he comes to the conclusion that, like, yeah, I mean, Bridges was friends with all these guys, right? He would consult with them. He was what was called at the time an influential within the party, and so they would consult him. The CP would consult him about stuff, but he never took orders from anyone, and he wasn't part of the party. And so part of the difficulty there is that, yes, people weren't totally open about things, but that, there was a fluidity that's not often recognized, right? It's like, oh, it's either a communist or not. Well, that's kind of giving into the whole anti-communist hysteria, this idea that like you're either one of them or not one of them. Mm-hmm. I think that what the communists could be faulted for, even more than the secretiveness, was the was the way in which they maneuvered within union locals. And that was a thing that pissed off a lot of people. So, again, a lot of times, you hear about the top CIO brass, Philip Murray in particular, who, in some stories only took the job of the head of the CIO after Lewis left, on the condition that he could eventually kick out the communists. So there's that. But a lot of the times in amongst the rank and file, they'd see the communists, do little tricks with Robert's rules, or have run slates for union locals, and be really, really manipulative about winning elections and controlling things. That pissed off a lot of people. Like, if you're secretive about your politics, that's one thing. But if you are actively exploring different machinations within union locals to take them over and run them, that's just going to piss a lot of people off. And so, yeah, it was the secretiveness, but it was their craftiness as well. I mean, they were really dedicated. And so like they convinced themselves that it was worth doing some kind of shady things to take over certain union locals. But, I mean, you can only do that stuff for so long without people kind of turning on you. So that's the communists. Okay. So, there's a few different ways in which to tackle your question about race, and then the way in which the CIO treated gender issues as well. So I think that in large part due to the early salutary influence of the communists, CIO organizing was remarkably egalitarian, and specifically in steel and packing house, there was a recognition that, like, despite the proclivities of rank and file workers, and, oftentimes these workers were activated on class, but they had come from, segregated backgrounds and still had racial biases. Like in those situations, it was oftentimes the CIO leadership convincing people that you have to have black workers in your union, right? You have to have different people of, there were also ethnic divisions at the time that aren't so, intelligible today, I guess. So, real animus towards Hungarians, for instance, that, like, I don't think we'd recognize as such the same problem as it is today. There were all sorts of divisions within the workplace. And I think in that early period, and specifically because of the influence of communists in a lot of key unions, and again, steel and packing house in particular, they were remarkably successful in overcoming those divisions, specifically for the point of organizing. It would be it's obviously romantic to think that, like, the white workers and the black workers would go hang out after work or something. It was still a very segregated society. But insofar as they were fighting for union power, the CIO was really good at overcoming those things. And, it wasn't just in word, right? They rhetorically were committed to a racial egalitarianism, but they hired black organizers, right? They understood that, like, you needed to change the organizing core in order to organize successfully. And And so, I think in this early period, it's really a model for how to overcome racial and ethnic division. That's not true by the time it bureaucratizes. And so if the CIO can be blamed for failures on that particular issue, it's in the bureaucratization. And so the steelworkers, for instance, very radical in its origins. So top down in its founding, but some of the key sort of communists were very influential within the steelworkers organizing committee. It's estimated that up to 80 people within the organizing core of 200 at the time were part of the Communist Party, right? They were very influential in getting the Steelworkers Organizing Committee off the ground. Well, by the time that they have the United Steelworkers of America, it switches from an organizing committee to a union. The leadership is negotiating contracts that reinstitute racial divisions, that affirm seniority practices that also reinforce those divisions. And so a lot of the people who were very influential in the beginning get shut out, and then when the CIO bureaucratizes, it's not as good on the question of race. On the question of gender, I would say that the CIO was never. It understood in the early days that racial and ethnic division was a clear problem that they had to overcome. That wasn't the case with gender. They clearly privileged the male breadwinner. They thought of the genesis of stable collective bargaining contracts as something that would re-empower the head of household to affirm the manliness or whatever, like his place within the family. They were oftentimes very against this is the CIO leaders. They were oftentimes very against certain welfare provisions that allowed for someone other than the head of household to be empowered. And so despite the fact that they organized women, so the International Ladies Garment Workers Unions was part of the CIO, despite the fact that they clearly did organize women, there was never an attempt to break down the gender divide in the way that there was an attempt to break down the racial divide. And in a large sense, that was just sort of part of the moment. I mean, there was no, especially in the top ranks of the CIO, there was no real questioning of that. Whereas the question of race was at the forefront of their minds. Oftentimes, especially near the end, CIO leaders were actually way out in front of the rank and file in terms of race. And so, Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, head of the CIO briefly before it merges with the AFL, he funded the March on Washington in 1963. He spoke at it, and a lot of UAW members were pissed off about that. They were upset, and George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO, famously did not support the march and regretted it later. But there's a lot in a lot of cases. The union leadership was much more progressive than the rank and file, and really dragged them along in their organizing and political efforts.
So, how much do you think the bureaucratization of the CIO actually is solidified by Taft-Hartley? I mean, clearly it starts way before then. It starts during the war. I mean, you would probably, even from what we've talked about, you've even probably put it 10 years before Taft-Hartley. But how much is it ossified by Taft-Hartley in 1947?
I would say the bureaucratization really comes with the war. That's when everything stabilizes. And, part of a successful bureaucracy is the ability to contain disruptiveness, right? To find channels within which that energy can go. And it was the war that provided them that experience. I mean, the CIO leadership was driving a car that was out of control throughout the late 30s, right? Like they knew that they weren't totally in charge of things, that they were dealing with a dynamic situation and doing their best. I mean, that's again the contradiction of being a union leader. Like, you want to stoke rank and file militancy at the same time that you want to contain it. So, publicly you're telling the workers to go back to work, but privately you're saying, hey, keep it up because this is the only source of leverage that I have. And in the war, they have a new experience, right? They're able to contain things in a new way, and they're very successful about doing that. Like, largely because of national sentiment, the desire to like participate in the war effort in a patriotic way. And then after the war, there's a lot of plans. There's a lot of actually fairly ambitious plans, and I don't think that that's totally appreciated sometimes. I think a lot of people say, oh, the CIO, they purged the communists in 48, 49, Taft-Hartley, like it was over by then. But, Reuther, John Brophy, a lot of the sort of key people in the CIO, they did have a vision a vision that was taken up in the later civil rights movement, for instance, right? A vision of full employment and, corporatist or tripartite negotiations where labor had a seat at the table. They were pushing for things. I think the problem, though, and the thing that Taft-Hartley did was to sort of like cut out the legs from under the CIO. So it was going to be stationary at that point because Taft-Hartley made it really difficult to take up again those tools that would allow for broad scale disruption, right? So, recognition strikes, secondary boycotting, like all the things that Taft-Hartley made illegal. And then a lot of Richie Zelson, the labor strategist, he says that Taft-Hartley was designed with a bunch of time bombs sort of embedded within it, right? And they've gone off at different moments. And we didn't often see the ways in which Taft-Hartley was going to be so negative. I mean, labor understood at the time that it was a disaster, right? Like everyone was arguing against it, but we didn't always see exactly the ways in which it would play out. And Taft-Hartley has been successful over the years at constraining union activity in very particular ways. More immediately, its provisions, its sort of anti-communist provisions, did impact the CIO fairly immediately. And so after 1947, the CIO begins to be pretty hostile to the communist unions. The United Electrical Workers was a huge union. So aside from the steel workers and the auto workers, I think it was the third largest union in the CIO at its peak. And shortly after Taft-Hartley, the writing's on the wall for a lot of the CIO leaders. Philip Murray sort of says, go for it. And the steel workers, the UAW, they begin raiding the UE, clearly stuff that is cause for expulsion from a labor federation. And they, Murray doesn't do anything about it. They allow it to happen. And the UE says, look, like, if you don't deal with this, we're going to leave the CIO. And they do. The CIO starts the IUE, the International Union of Electrical Radio and Machine Workers, and they begin raiding the UE. It's a nasty, nasty battle between these two unions. IUE is, firmly anti-communist. The UE's leadership, I think it's safe to say, was actually they were actually members of the Communist Party. So James Matlis and Julius Emspak, most people think that they were pretty tied to the CP. So the fallout there was pretty ugly, and I think the CIO expelled 8 to 10 unions altogether, and by that point, any kind of radical energy the CIO had is gone, and it's a fully bureaucratic institution, and it would only be a few years before it remerged with the AFL. I think that there's an open question though about the necessity of those actions. I think that most historians would say, that was a huge mistake, right? Just buying into that anti-communist hysteria. Some other people thought that the communists had behaved pretty badly by that point, and that it wasn't just the CIO leadership that to actually contain the rank and file reaction against the communists. They argue that the CIO leadership, like they needed to pursue that split. And so, it's a complicated situation. And I think that I would certainly side with, with the idea that it was a disaster. It was a disaster for the unions. It was the workers who lost in that purge. But a lot of things were going on that, led to the communists being discredited by a lot of people. And so that fracture, ugly as it was, to some historians was kind of a necessity, that it was always going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I guess that leads me to, we have to deal with the union's relationship to the Democratic Party at this point. And it is often blamed on both the communist shift from the Popular Front, from the United Front from below to the Popular Front, and just the New Deal coalition in general, how the left got subsumed by the Democrats. I actually do like to point out that trajectory started about 30 years prior, in a time that it made even less sense, with the Populist Party linking up with the left of the Democrats in the progressive movement in 1900 and liquidating themselves into that. So it wasn't like the 1930s was the first time that happened, but the relationship of the Democrats to Taft-Hartley is something that I think is subtle, in that Truman vetoed it, but he also was the first president to invoke it.
Yeah.
So how did the CIO deal with its relationship to the Democratic Party, as it seemed like the kind of New Deal coalition was at least fraying?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a common criticism of the CIO, that it bought into the Democratic Party too much, that it was too allied to FDR, certainly. And as, perhaps mistaken as Lewis's departure from the CIO was, and his support for Willkie was, at least he understood that the labor movement needed some independence from the Democratic Party if it was going to maintain its power. And one could argue that he was right about that. So the relationship with the Democratic Party, I think, is complicated. A lot of New Left historians in particular believed that it was a missed opportunity not to invest in a labor party. And again, certainly a lot of people thought that when Lewis was making his big announcement in 1940, that he was announcing the formation of a labor party. Most of the historians that I talked to thought that was a non-starter, that was just not going to happen at that particular moment, that FDR was always way more popular than the CIO. And, whatever independent political force the CIO could have brought to bear, it would have been nothing compared to the Democratic Party. So that's interesting. I mean, that in retrospect, it seems like kind of a non-starter, that most people agree that the Labor Party, if they had pursued it, would have been a mistake. It perhaps would have led to local gains in different ways, but certainly at the national level, we're talking about national policy and national support for labor. That was kind of a non-starter. The concern, of course, is that the Democratic Party again becomes that graveyard of social movements, and that in buying into the in buying into the Democratic Party, the CIO essentially just capitulated. There's another way to look at that, which I'm more convinced by, which is that what the CIO appreciated about the Democratic Party was not that it was on the side of labor, but simply that it wouldn't send in the guns. I think that's the sort of key thing, and something that I'm broadly convinced by, that it's really difficult for unions to have much success if they're going to be met with straightforward repression as supported by the government business alliance. It's a really difficult thing to confront. And traditionally, that's been the cause of failure, right? When brutal repression has entered the scene. And what happened in the late 30s, and what made possible the CIO's success, was not the fact that FDR was rhetorically for unions. He was, and that helped, certainly. but the fact that people like Governor Frank Murphy in Michigan wouldn't send in the National Guard. And I think that that's what the CIO appreciated about the Democratic Party, that these were people who, yeah, I mean, they were full of it in one sense. They were not friends of labor in the sense that you would hope for politicians to be, but they at least were going to neutralize that traditional government business alliance. And that's what they saw in the Democratic Party at the time. And I kind of think that they were right to do that. And, you know, I think that part of the difficulty with the discussion about the Democratic Party is that the left or labor wants to, you know, point out the disjunctions between all these different entities. And the Democratic Party is going to be what the Democratic Party is. The question for labor is whether it's going to be neutral at the correct times. And I think that that's a much more sober approach to the Democratic Party than saying, oh, this liberal X, Y, or Z is a failure because of this or that. Yeah, of course, they're Democrats. But the question is like whether they're going to not do the thing that's traditionally done at the correct moments. And that's what the CIO saw in the Democratic Party. And as much as that's the case, I think that they were correct to see it.
I guess this is probably going to be my last question, but it is one about historiography of the labor movement. So how much of our understanding of labor is actually read through the political and cultural matrices of the times that we are writing about labor? So a lot of the big studies of the 1930s are written in the 1960s, and the nuances of the relationship to the Democrats, for example, well, that makes a lot of sense to focus on or to be really mad about in 1968. And it also makes sense in the 1970s when you look at how much of, for example, the discretionary budget of unions are going into lobbying, specifically the Democratic Party. Whereas from the standpoint of today, we might be reading both our hopes and our fears about the Democrats, you know, into our understanding of the 1930s too, because today we have a Democratic Party which at one section can't get the PRO Act through, has made promises to labor explicitly that it's not been able to or not wanted to, depending on who you trust, to deliver on. At the same time, we actually have seen reforms that are favorable to labor for the first time in, I don't know, 40 years. So it seems like that might also flavor our view now. So how much do you think the historiography of the historians doing the labor history is actually affecting our understanding of that history? That's my big question.
Oh, it's huge. And I think that the present moment is actually one for better understanding that than the 1960s. Ruth Milkman, who's a professor of sociology at CUNY, she was very explicit about this. She said when she was in graduate school, it was really funny to see the kinds of things that were being written, things that look, you know, radically out of touch today, real incisive critiques of big labor and whatnot. You know, one of those strange points of consonance between the new left and the emerging right. And also the fact that there was almost nothing written at that time about the United Steelworkers, which was at that time a huge union, one of the most powerful in the country. You know, new left labor historians just didn't really care. Like they were interested in the UAW, UE, more democratic unions with these, you know, heroic rank and file stories. And so there was a non-recognition of a huge part of what made the CIO successful because of the romanticization of certain things about the CIO, but not others. At present, I think that we're in a better position to sort of appreciate the CIO, to sort of see it with sober senses and to see where it failed, where the political economic context differs from the present in such a way that the lessons there are non-applicable to the present, but also to appreciate its real gains, to appreciate the fact that it's, again, really the one time in American history where you can say they won very decisively, and it resulted in a kind of revolution in working class living standards. Jack Metzger, who wrote a book about steel, at the beginning talked about whether or not that moment was a revolutionary one or not. He says, you compare what it was like growing up in a steelworker's family before the CIO, and then you look at the living standards after the CIO, and he says, if this isn't revolution, I don't know what is. So it's a time when they won, and I think that we should appreciate that. I mean, I think that the left has a tendency to romanticize the fights that we can get in against the bosses, and that's great and that's necessary, but we need to prioritize winning, and that's what the CIO did, I think, laudably.
I think that's a good point to end on, and I think maybe because we're in a moment where there's both labor militancy, real labor militancy for the first time. It's been kind of building actually for about 15 years, but interestingly and paradoxically, it is not translating into labor density at all. At least unless the Bureau of Labor Statistics stats that we were talking about at the beginning of the show are radically different than I predict they're going to be. And I think that does leave us in a kind of a lurch. And one of the things that, I come out of the very far left, and I've studied labor for a long time, and I'm a union rep, et cetera, et cetera. I've done the stuff you're supposed to do. And you go in and you look at his heroic periods, particularly if you're one of those people who came up in the 90s, who was actually very informed by the 60s and 70s historiography. And you look at, the IWW, but then you have to conclude well, they lost though. And they didn't lose a little, they lost bad. And then you look at the real revolution in working class life. It is undone, but it does actually take a remarkably long time to undo. I mean, in some sense, considering how fast it was built. If you look at how those labor gains were made basically in 4 years, and it took about 35 to claw them back, in about, during the 1950s, one of the paradoxical things is, we can see where the labor movement is being destroyed, but they still look to be winning in terms of gains, actually, as far as what they want during that moment. And that is a paradox that we often forget now. People probably weren't that worried because labor really did have, even during the Eisenhower administration, a seat at the table. Now that is all clawed back by the early 70s, but it takes the early 70s to do it. And so I do think looking at that fairly objectively is important, but I like you think we have to look at it almost, to use that dirty D word again, dialectically, in so much that you start seeing the success and failures being intimately related, that you cannot actually just parse them out on a simple, if the CIO never rejoined with the AFL, or if the CIO hadn't bureaucratized during the war, and you're well, what would they have done? And also they did it for reasons that were actually smart. Similarly, we talked about the communists. A lot of the things that undo the communists, they were actually doing, I would say, not because they were sneaky conspirators, but because they were rationally concerned about people responding to them. And the people responding to them weren't being irrational because the communists have been up to some shenanigans. Yeah. So it's, when you look at it more that way, maybe you can form a more realistic systemic view. Although I will say it does make me feel like the next 5 to 10 years are pretty do or die for the U.S. labor movement.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't find dialectic to be a dirty word. I guess if you're using a lot of cocaine, maybe it can be, but otherwise it's fine. On the question of historiography, it's a good one, and I do think that we're in more sober moment for the appreciation of the CIO. It's sort of part of why I wanted to do the podcast, just to bring on, well, I mean, part of it was just to capture the voices of an elder generation of labor historians who you don't hear from much anymore, and that was a huge, get, I think, to be talking to people like Melvin Dubofsky and David Brody and whatnot. But part of it is, I think, that we can, we're past that 60s New Left moment that's overly critical of the CIO in a variety of ways, and can appreciate its gains much more. I think actually, we're not yet at the moment where we can appreciate with sober senses that post-war period and the miscues and also successes of what happened then. And, I think a reckoning there is quite necessary too. That, yes, it was bureaucracy in a lot of ways. Yes, they had lost that dynamism of the early period, but there were good reasons for pursuing things as they did, and a broader appreciation for that is necessary. There's a great book, David Brody's Workers in Industrial America, where he looks at this. He devotes 2 chapters to what he calls the uses of power, and what the CIO and what labor leaders and what progressive Democrats did at this moment where, for the first time, they were dealing with a complete anomaly in American life, which is that corporate power was limited, not reined in, but limited in ways that certain things were possible. It's certainly not the present moment, but I think soberly understanding what they did right and what they did wrong, that's still to be done as well.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Ben. People should check out your podcast, Organizing the Unorganized, over at Jacobin Radio. If you are to look it up, there's another podcast called Organizing the Unorganized. It's about organizing your closet. So look up the Jacobin Radio one.
That's what the labor movement is in competition with today. Movements for self-care.
All right. That was an excellent interview. Thanks again for being here, Ben, and thank you, Varn.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
We are out.